October 4th, 1918, 7:36 in the evening. A woman named Margaret Wark stands at her kitchen sink in the company housing at Morgan, New Jersey. She is washing dishes. Her two daughters, ages 12 and 10, are playing somewhere in the small home their father's munitions job has provided them. Through the window, she can see the endless sprawl of corrugated steel buildings stretching toward the Raritan Bay. 700 buildings. 2,200 acres. 30 million pounds of explosives, the largest shell-loading plant in the world. Her husband, Harry, is working the night shift somewhere out there in that maze of TNT and artillery shells. The plant has been operating for 4 months without incident. Tonight, the war that seemed so far away is about to arrive at her front door. The first blast came from Building 611. No one knows what sparked it. No one ever will. The employment records, the shift logs, the witness statements from the workers closest to the ignition point, all of it vaporized in the initial detonation. What the investigators pieced together later was this. At 7:36 p.m. on October 4th, 1918, something in the shell-loading area caught fire. Maybe a spark from a tool, maybe friction from improper handling, maybe sabotage. The inquiry would never determine the cause. It would only count the cost. Margaret Wark's 10-year-old daughter was standing at her kitchen window in the company housing at Morgan, New Jersey, when the first fireball rose into the sky. A piece of shrapnel, maybe part of an artillery shell, maybe a fragment of corrugated steel, came screaming through the glass. It missed the girl by inches. The family ran. Harry Wark, somewhere in the chaos of the plant, ran too. They would find each other later in the darkness as 62,000 people fled their homes, and the largest non-nuclear explosion in American history continued to detonate behind them. The T.A. Gillespie Company's shell-loading plant was producing 32,000 artillery shells every single day. Enough ammunition to supply the Western Front for 6 months was stored on those 2,000 acres. And in the space of 3 days, roughly 100 workers would vanish completely, some so thoroughly atomized by the blasts that not even bone fragments remained to bury. The unidentified remains of 14 to 18 workers were eventually gathered into a single mass grave. A stone marker was placed above them in 1929. 11 years after the disaster. It reads, "In memory of the unidentified dead who gave their lives while in the service of the United States of America." These workers never saw France. They never heard German artillery. They died making the shells that would win the war in a forgotten corner of New Jersey 47 days before the armistice was signed. This is the story of the T.A. Gillespie Company, the contractor who built the plant, the government that demanded the impossible, the workers who paid the price, and the community that was evacuated, exposed, and ultimately forgotten. It is the story of a disaster so complete that over a century later, unexploded ordnance is still being dug up from elementary school playgrounds. Thomas Andrew Gillespie was born in 1852 in an America that did not yet understand what industrial warfare would require. By the time the Great War began in Europe in 1914, he was 62 years old and had built a successful contracting company based in New York. The T.A. Gillespie Company was not originally in the explosives business. They built railroads, infrastructure, the kind of heavy construction that expanding cities required in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Gillespie himself was a product of the Gilded Age, a time when contractors made fortunes by taking on the projects that seemed impossible and completing them through sheer force of will, capital, and expendable labor. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, the government faced a staggering problem. The American military was not prepared for industrial warfare on the scale the Western Front demanded. The British and French had learned through years of brutal experience that modern war consumed artillery shells at rates previously unimaginable. During the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British fired over 1.7 million shells in the preliminary bombardment alone, a week-long barrage that still failed to break the German lines. Artillery had become the primary killer of the war, and the United States had almost no capacity to manufacture the high-explosive shells that modern warfare demanded. The government turned to private contractors. The T.A. Gillespie Company received a contract to build and operate a shell-loading plant in Morgan, New Jersey, a small community in the eastern section of Sayreville, situated on the Raritan Bay. The location offered access to water transportation, proximity to rail lines, and enough undeveloped land to construct the sprawling facility the government demanded. The Raritan Bay provided a natural highway for barges carrying finished shells to the shipping ports of New York Harbor. The Pennsylvania Railroad ran directly through the site, allowing raw materials to flow in and completed munitions to flow out with minimal handling. From a logistics perspective, Morgan was nearly ideal. What it also offered, though this would prove catastrophic, was proximity to several established towns. South Amboy sat just to the north, a community built around the railroad and ceramic industries. Perth Amboy was across the Raritan River, an industrial city with its own history of factory work and immigrant labor. Smaller settlements dotted the surrounding area: farms, fishing villages, the scattered residences of people who had lived on this land for generations before the war made it strategically valuable. The combined population of these communities was approximately 62,000 people. Building the largest explosives handling facility in the world within a few miles of that, many civilians, was a decision that would haunt everyone involved. Construction began in early 1918. The pace was ferocious. 700 buildings rose from the New Jersey marshland in a matter of months, an entire industrial city conjured from swamp and ambition. Each building served a specific function in the complex choreography of shell production: receiving stations for empty casings, heating facilities to melt the TNT, loading buildings where workers poured the molten explosive, assembly areas for fuses and boosters, magazines for storage, and rail yards for shipping. The empty steel casings arrived by rail from foundries in Pennsylvania. The TNT, trinitrotoluene, the high explosive that would fill those casings, came from chemical plants across New Jersey, many of them hastily constructed for this specific purpose. At Morgan, these two components were brought together in a process that required precision, care, and an acceptance of constant danger. The facility sprawled across 2,200 acres, larger than many American cities, connected by an internal rail network that moved materials and finished products between buildings. Workers traveled to their stations aboard small locomotives that crisscrossed the site. The scale was deliberately fragmented. Buildings were separated by calculated distances intended to prevent a single explosion from triggering chain reactions across the facility. Earth-filled bulkheads surrounded the most dangerous areas, designed to contain blasts and direct explosive force upward rather than outward. These precautions reflected the best understanding of explosive safety available in 1918. They would prove insufficient. TNT was not a forgiving substance. It turned the skin of workers bright yellow, a phenomenon that earned British munitions workers the nickname "Canary Girls" during the war. The yellow staining was unsettling but not fatal. Prolonged exposure caused far worse problems: liver damage, anemia, a condition called toxic jaundice that killed roughly 100 British munitions workers during the war years. The workers at Morgan knew the risks, or at least understood them in the abstract way that workers in dangerous industries always do. The job paid well. The housing was provided. The work felt meaningful. They accepted the danger because the alternative was watching the war from the sidelines while other men's sons died for lack of ammunition. The shell loading process itself was methodical and terrifying. Empty shell casings moved through the facility on an assembly line basis, passing through buildings where workers poured molten TNT into their steel bodies. The TNT had to be heated to around 80 degrees Celsius to become liquid, then carefully poured to avoid air bubbles or impurities that might cause unpredictable detonation. After the explosive filler was loaded, workers inserted boosters and attached fuses. Each step was performed by hand. Each step carried the possibility of catastrophe. By June 1918, the plant had achieved full production. 32,000 shells per day poured out of Morgan, loaded onto barges and rail cars for transport to the ports where they would be shipped to France. The plant employed more than 6,000 workers operating around the clock in 3 shifts. The night shift, the shift that would bear the brunt of the disaster, was considered both the most difficult and the most lucrative, with premium pay for those willing to work through the hours when most people slept. Over 1 million loaded shells were present on the site at any given time, stored in magazines or sitting on rail cars awaiting transport. 30 million pounds of explosives were distributed across the facility: TNT, ammonium nitrate, cordite propellant, detonators, boosters, and completed shells ready for shipment. The government's 1919 report would later estimate that the ammunition destroyed in the explosion would have supplied the Western Front for 6 months. 6 months of bombardments, 6 months of artillery support, 6 months of shells screaming across no man's land, all of it stored within a few miles of where American families slept. The facility operated with the relentless rhythm of industrial warfare. Raw materials flowed in by rail and barge. Finished shells flowed out by the same routes. Between arrival and departure, thousands of workers performed the intricate tasks that transformed empty steel casings into instruments of death. The process ran continuously, pausing only for maintenance and shift changes. Production targets were paramount. The boys in France needed ammunition, and every shell that didn't reach the front was a shell that couldn't be fired at the enemy. This urgency shaped everything about the Morgan plant: its construction, its operation, and ultimately its destruction. The workers at Morgan were a diverse group: local residents, immigrants, native-born Americans, skilled workers and laborers with no relevant experience. Some had traveled from nearby cities, drawn by wages that exceeded what they could earn in other industries. Others were recent arrivals to the country, finding in munitions work a path to steady employment that required no English fluency and few questions about their backgrounds. Women worked in some sections of the plant, though the most dangerous shell-loading tasks were typically assigned to men. The workforce included Germans and Austrians, citizens of the very nations America was fighting, who had lived in the United States long enough to call it home, and who proved their loyalty by accepting the most dangerous work the war required. What they shared was their vulnerability. Munitions workers were considered so high risk that they were individually uninsurable. No life insurance company would write a policy for someone who spent their working hours surrounded by TNT. The actuarial tables made the calculation simple. The probability of catastrophic loss was too high, and the potential liability too great. Workers who wanted to protect their families had to do so through savings or through benefits provided by the company, benefits that would prove woefully inadequate when the disaster came. This absence of insurance would prove significant in the disaster's aftermath. When the explosions destroyed the plant's employment records, the government lost its ability to identify exactly who had been working that night. Some workers simply vanished. No body recovered. No clear record of their presence, their families left to wonder. The evening of October 4th, 1918, began like any other shift. The day crews had handed off to the night shift. Approximately 2,000 men were working throughout the facility. In the loading areas, workers poured TNT. In the assembly buildings, others attached fuses. In the storage magazines, finished shells awaited transport. The sun had set. At 7:36 p.m., Building 6211 exploded. The blast wave shattered windows across the plant and ruptured the facility's water main, one of the most consequential effects of the first detonation, as the firefighting system had been crippled before the fires could be fought. The fireball rose into the New Jersey sky like a second sunset. Workers throughout the plant heard the explosion and felt the ground shake beneath their feet. Then they saw the fire spreading, and then they ran. As the fire spread from Building 6211, it reached other structures containing TNT, loaded shells, and components at various stages of completion. Each new fire triggered new explosions. Artillery shells, heated beyond their design tolerance, detonated in place or were launched into the air, landing across the surrounding area like a bombardment from an invisible enemy army. The workers who escaped the initial blast found themselves navigating a nightmare landscape of fire, falling debris, and whistling shells. The darkness made everything worse. The first explosion had damaged the power lines, plunging much of the plant into shadow. The firefighters who arrived from South Amboy and Perth Amboy discovered that the ruptured water main had left them nearly helpless. Fire hydrants throughout the plant produced only a trickle of water. Their role shifted from firefighting to rescue, pulling survivors from the debris and helping the wounded escape the blast radius. At approximately 1:30 a.m., Coast Guard personnel from Perth Amboy arrived at the plant. They had been alerted by a watchman who saw the sky light up across the Raritan River and immediately understood that something catastrophic was unfolding at Morgan. By the time they reached the facility, they found complete chaos. No one was in charge. The plant's management had evacuated with everyone else, their authority dissolved by the same explosions that had destroyed the buildings they were supposed to oversee. The facility's security guards were overwhelmed trying to prevent desperate family members from rushing back into the plant to search for loved ones. First Lieutenant Joseph Stika took command of the Coast Guard response. 29 years old, a 1911 graduate of the Coast Guard Academy at New London, Stika had been trained for maritime emergencies. Nothing in his training had prepared him for an entire industrial facility detonating piecemeal with thousands of workers unaccounted for. He improvised. Stika organized his men into rescue teams, posting guards at the plant entrances to prevent civilians from entering while coordinating the removal of survivors. The work was incredibly dangerous. To reach workers trapped in the outer sections of the facility, rescue teams had to pass through areas where shells were still detonating, where fires still burned, where the next explosion might come without warning. What Stika and his men found in the chaos was a nightmare that threatened to become immeasurably worse. A train consisting of 9 railroad cars, all of them loaded with TNT, was sitting on tracks directly in the path of the advancing fire. The cars contained enough explosive material to dwarf everything that had detonated so far. If that train caught fire and exploded, it would trigger a blast large enough to potentially destroy not just the plant, but the surrounding towns as well. The 62,000 civilians fleeing the area might be running into an even larger disaster. The Coast Guardsmen faced an impossible choice: abandon the train and hope the fire changed direction, or attempt to move it through an area already experiencing secondary explosions. Stika chose to move the train, with volunteer assistance from local workers who had remained at the facility and New Jersey National Guardsmen who had arrived to help with the evacuation. His team began the arduous process of laying additional track in front of the train cars. The existing track led directly toward the fires. They would have to create a new path, building the escape route as they went, working by firelight with shells detonating around them. They worked for hours, dodging shells and shrapnel, with the knowledge that any moment could bring the detonation that would kill them all. The TNT in those cars was stable under normal conditions, but nothing about that night was normal. Heat from nearby fires, concussive force from explosions, the vibration of shells landing nearby. Any of these could have triggered the train's cargo. The men who worked to move it did so in full awareness that they might be incinerated before completing their task. They succeeded. The train was moved over a mile from the fire zone and concealed between two earthen mounds that would direct any blast upward if the worst occurred. 12 Coast Guardsmen, including Stika, would later receive the Navy Cross for their actions, the second highest decoration for valor that the Navy could award, typically reserved for extraordinary heroism in combat. 2 Coast Guardsmen died in the rescue effort. Their citations describe conduct under conditions that amounted to combat, moving through an active bombardment to save lives and prevent an even greater catastrophe. Joseph Stika would later rise to Vice Admiral, but that night, he was simply the highest-ranking officer on scene at a disaster no one had anticipated. While the Coast Guard was saving the train, the civilian evacuation was becoming the largest forced displacement in New Jersey history. Government authorities declared martial law and ordered the complete evacuation of Sayreville, South Amboy, and Perth Amboy. 62,000 people were told to leave their homes immediately. The evacuation routes passed through areas still receiving falling debris. Artillery shells, propelled into the air by the force of detonating magazines, fell across the surrounding countryside like random strikes of lightning. Families fled on foot, by car, by wagon, by any means available, carrying whatever they could grab in the moments before authorities arrived. The roads out of the evacuation zone became clogged with refugees. Automobiles sat immobile in traffic, while their occupants listened to explosions continuing behind them. Families with horses and wagons made better progress on the side roads, but even they moved slowly through the darkness. The scene reminded observers of photographs from the Western Front. Civilians fleeing before an advancing disaster, their possessions abandoned, their futures uncertain. Newspaper reporters who arrived from New York compared it to the refugee columns they had seen in pictures from Belgium and France, the endless streams of displaced people that had become one of the war's defining images. This was what the war looked like when it came home. Not the glory of victory parades, but the terror of civilians running from forces beyond their control. Many evacuees had nowhere to go. Hotels and boarding houses in the surrounding areas filled immediately, turning away families who had arrived too late to secure rooms. Police stations opened their doors to refugees, their cells and waiting rooms filled with people who had committed no crime except living too close to the largest explosives facility in the world. Churches opened their doors. Schools became emergency shelters. Families who had relatives outside the blast zone crowded into homes not designed to hold them, doubling and tripling up in bedrooms while the explosions continued through the night. Others simply slept outside, finding open fields or wooded areas where they could wait for the explosions to stop. October in New Jersey is cold at night, particularly in the early hours before dawn, and these refugees had fled with whatever clothing they were wearing when the evacuation order came. Some had run from their homes in nightclothes. Some had children in their arms. All of them waited through the cold hours of October 5th, watching the southern sky glow orange and wondering when, or if, they would be able to return home. The explosions continued through October 5th. At 2:01 a.m., major detonations shook the area again, throwing residents who had returned to their homes back out of their beds. At 4:10 a.m., another massive blast. At 10:09 a.m., yet another. Throughout the day, the pattern continued. Periods of relative quiet punctuated by enormous detonations as the fire reached new caches of explosives. Each blast was felt for miles. Windows shattered in Newark. The shocks were reportedly felt in Manhattan, across the harbor, where New Yorkers looked south toward the orange glow that lit the night sky and wondered what was happening in New Jersey. The rescue operations continued throughout the disaster, even as new explosions threatened the rescuers themselves. Volunteer firefighters worked alongside Coast Guard personnel and local police, pulling survivors from debris and searching for the dead. The work was complicated by the ongoing detonations, which could occur at any moment without warning. Every rescue attempt was a calculated risk. weighing the possibility of saving lives against the possibility of losing more. Some rescuers were killed in secondary explosions while attempting to reach survivors. Their courage deserves recognition that has largely not been given. The families of workers faced their own ordeal during those 3 days. Wives and children waited at evacuation points, scanning crowds of refugees for familiar faces, never certain whether the next blast would bring news of survival or confirmation of loss. The chaos of the evacuation made communication nearly impossible. Telephone lines were overwhelmed when they worked at all. Families who had been separated in the initial flight spent days not knowing whether loved ones had escaped the plant or remained somewhere in the inferno. The fires burned for 3 days. By the evening of October 6th, the worst appeared to be over. The work of counting the dead and assessing the damage could finally begin. The destruction was almost incomprehensible. Of the 700 buildings at the plant, 325 were completely destroyed. The property was cratered like a battlefield, with one crater measuring 30 feet deep, 140 feet wide, and 150 feet long. The former location of an ammonium nitrate storage facility containing 1 million pounds of explosive. Of the 30 million pounds of explosives on site, roughly 12 million pounds had detonated. Over 300,000 loaded shells had been destroyed. The human toll was harder to quantify. The estimate of approximately 100 dead was assembled from fragmentary evidence. The number of workers who failed to report for subsequent shifts, accounts from survivors who had seen colleagues killed, the unidentified remains recovered from the debris. Many bodies were never recovered at all. The workers closest to the detonation sites had been vaporized. The unidentified remains that could be gathered were placed in a common grave on Ernston Road, unmarked for 11 years until the South Amboy Lions Club erected a memorial stone in 1929. Beyond the plant, more than 300 buildings in South Amboy and the surrounding areas had been destroyed or damaged. The downtown commercial district was devastated. Storefronts with their windows blown out, buildings with walls cracked by the repeated concussions, roofs collapsed from the impact of falling debris. Artillery shells had flown over a mile from the plant, landing among civilian structures that had been built on the assumption that such a thing could never happen. Bayview Manor, one of the largest residences in the area, had been struck by a shell and burned to the ground. The owner was away at the time. The structure was a total loss. The pattern of destruction extended in all directions from the plant, with damage diminishing gradually as distance increased. Homes closest to the facility were demolished. Those farther away lost windows and suffered structural cracks. Even homes that appeared intact often proved uninhabitable once residents returned to inspect them. Roofs that leaked, foundations that had shifted, walls that were no longer plumb. The visible damage was only part of the story. The invisible damage to structures that had been stressed beyond their design limits would emerge gradually over the following months and years. The property damage was estimated at $18 million in 1918 currency, equivalent to roughly $360 million today. This figure included the destroyed plant itself, the damaged civilian structures, the lost contents of homes that had been looted during the evacuation or destroyed in the fires that followed falling shells, and the economic disruption caused by the displacement of tens of thousands of people. The federal government eventually paid $300,000 to area residents for their losses, a fraction of the actual damage, and an amount that left many families struggling to rebuild. The gap between the compensation offered and the losses suffered became another source of grievance in communities that already felt they had been treated as expendable. Then came the Spanish flu. The evacuation had displaced 62,000 people during the early days of October 1918. These refugees had crowded into temporary shelters, police stations, hotels, and the homes of relatives and strangers. They had slept outdoors in the autumn cold, exposed to the elements and to each other. They had been subjected to the stress, exhaustion, and exposure that accompanies any mass displacement. And they did all of this precisely as the deadliest wave of the Spanish influenza pandemic was sweeping through the northeastern United States. The pandemic had arrived in North America in the late summer of 1918, spreading rapidly through military camps and urban populations. It moved with terrifying speed, filling hospitals to capacity and overwhelming public health systems that had no treatment to offer and no way to prevent transmission. By October, it was killing thousands of Americans per day. Philadelphia had buried 4,500 people in a single week. New York's health system was on the verge of collapse. The virus was uniquely dangerous to otherwise healthy adults. Unlike typical influenza strains that killed primarily the elderly and very young, the Spanish flu was most lethal to people between 20 and 40 years old. Medical historians still debate why this was so, But the pattern was clear in 1918. The strongest, healthiest members of society were the most likely to die. The same demographic that formed the workforce at Morgan, the same demographic that had fled their homes and spent nights in crowded shelters and open fields. The connection between the Morgan explosion and elevated influenza mortality in the affected communities was noted at the time and has been confirmed by subsequent research. Evacuees weakened by exposure, stress, and inadequate shelter proved more susceptible to the virus. Those who had spent nights outdoors, who had crowded into emergency shelters with hundreds of strangers, who had fled their homes without adequate clothing or provisions. These people fell ill at elevated rates. The disaster had killed those who died in the explosions, and then it had weakened those who survived sufficiently that the pandemic could claim additional victims. The timing seemed almost incomprehensibly cruel. On October 4th, the night the first explosion rocked Morgan, New York City's health department was implementing its first measures to combat the spreading epidemic. Staggered business hours to reduce crowding on public transit, mandatory face masks in some settings, public education campaigns about the danger of coughing and sneezing. These measures were inadequate to contain a pandemic that was already out of control, but they represented the first acknowledgement that extraordinary action was needed. Workers who had survived the explosions fell ill in evacuation shelters. Families who had lost members to the blasts then lost more to the disease. The fall of 1918 was a season of compounded tragedy for the communities of central New Jersey. The war ended 47 days after the Morgan explosion. On November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed in a railway car in the forest of Compiègne, France. The guns fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Church bells rang across America. Crowds filled the streets of every major city. Strangers embraced in Times Square and Market Street and Broad Street. The war to end all wars was over. At Morgan, the silence came too late. The plant had been destroyed. The workers were dead. The community had been evacuated, infected, and traumatized. And now, with the war ended, the shells that had been loaded at such terrible cost would never be fired. The ammunition that had justified the risks, that had explained the urgency, that had made the location and the scale and the speed of construction seem necessary. All of it was suddenly obsolete. The facility that had been built with such desperate urgency would never reopen. The T.A. Gillespie Company's shell loading plant closed as a government facility in early 1919. Its mission completed not by success, but by obsolescence. The irony was lost on no one who noticed it. The disaster had occurred 47 days before the very ammunition it produced became unnecessary. The workers who died had given their lives for shells that would never be fired, for a war that was about to end, whether those shells existed or not. This timing, so close to the end, so clearly futile in retrospect, added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating event. If the plant had simply continued operating without incident for another 6 weeks, it would have been shut down anyway. The entire enterprise would have become a historical footnote rather than a catastrophe. The formal investigation into the disaster produced no definitive answer about its cause. Sabotage was initially suspected. The Black Tom explosion of 1916, just 2 years earlier, had demonstrated that German agents were willing and able to attack American munitions facilities. Black Tom had destroyed 2 million pounds of ammunition at a depot in Jersey City, killing 7 people and causing damage still visible in the Statue of Liberty's torch, which has been closed to visitors ever since. The explosion had blown out windows in Lower Manhattan and was heard as far away as Philadelphia. German intelligence had coordinated the attack as part of a broader campaign to disrupt American supplies to the Allies, conducted while the United States was still officially neutral. The shadow of Black Tom hung over the Morgan investigation. If German saboteurs had struck once, they could strike again. And the war was still being fought when the Morgan disaster occurred. Investigators examined what evidence remained, interviewed survivors, and searched for any indication that enemy agents had penetrated the facility. But the Morgan inquiry found no evidence of enemy action. The most probable cause was accident, human error in the handling of explosives, or equipment failure, or some combination of factors that would never be known, because everyone with direct knowledge of the ignition had died in it. The employment records that might have revealed who was working in Building 611, and thus who might have made a fatal mistake, had been vaporized along with the workers themselves. The war ended before the investigation could reach definitive conclusions, and with the war's end came a collective desire to move on. The urgent questions of October 1918, what happened, who was responsible, how to prevent recurrence, gave way to the urgent priorities of November, celebrating victory demobilizing millions of soldiers, transitioning from wartime to peacetime economy. The Morgan explosion faded from public attention almost as quickly as it had occurred. Thomas Andrew Gillespie survived the disaster that bore his company's name. He was 66 years old in October 1918, and he would live another 8 years, dying in 1926 at 74. His company underwent a series of transformations, renamed the Gillespie Motor Company in 1919, merged to form the Gillespie Eden Corporation in 1920, and disappeared entirely sometime after 1923. The contractor who had built one of the largest industrial disasters in American history left surprisingly little trace in the historical record. No biography was written. No personal papers have survived in archives. The man is remembered only through the catastrophe that carries his name. The site of the Morgan plant was cleared and eventually redeveloped. The 700 buildings, or rather, the approximately 400 that had survived the explosions in any recognizable form, were demolished. The debris was collected, sorted, and disposed of according to the standards of the era, which meant that much of it was simply buried on site or dumped in areas where it was unlikely to be disturbed. The craters were filled, the land was graded. Where 700 buildings had once stood, suburbs grew. The transformation took decades. In the immediate aftermath, the site was considered too contaminated and too dangerous for civilian use. The military retained control of portions of the property, using some areas for storage and leaving others fenced and abandoned. Gradually, as memories faded and development pressures increased, parcels were sold for residential and commercial construction. Of the original plant structures, only 2 survived the demolition, transformed over the decades into local businesses and part of a marina, hardly recognizable as remnants of one of the largest munitions facilities in the world. But the explosion's debris did not disappear with the buildings. Artillery shells, launched into the air during the 3 days of detonations, had fallen across an area more than 1.2 miles in radius. Many had not detonated on impact. They lay buried in the soil, waiting for the passage of time to bring them back to the surface, or for human activity to disturb their rest. The first major discovery came in 1994, when shells were found near Sayreville's Dwight D. Eisenhower Elementary School. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was called in, removing over 5,080 pieces of ordnance from the area across multiple cleanup operations. Another discovery in 1997 triggered additional work. In 2007, ordnance was found at Samsel Upper Elementary School, while workers were grading land for a playground. Children had been playing for years above unexploded shells from the First World War. A local safety official told reporters, "We find these things a couple of times a year in town." The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers designated the former Morgan General Ordnance Depot as a formerly used defense site, subjecting it to ongoing environmental investigation. The designation placed Morgan in the same category as hundreds of other military sites across the country, places where wartime activity had left hazardous materials that required decades or centuries of remediation. A 2024 remedial investigation was initiated to assess munitions and explosives of concern across a 3,156-acre munitions response site encompassing portions of Sayreville, South Amboy, and Old Bridge. The investigation employed ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and other geophysical techniques to locate buried ordnance without disturbing it. The work was expected to continue through 2026, with a final report in 2027, more than a century after the original disaster. The scope of potential contamination extends beyond unexploded shells. TNT itself is an environmental contaminant, and the millions of pounds that detonated or scattered across the site left chemical residues in soil and groundwater. The manufacturing and handling of explosives generated waste streams that were disposed of according to 1918 standards, which is to say, disposed of in ways that would be illegal today. The full environmental legacy of the Morgan plant may never be completely characterized or remediated. Thousands of residential structures and commercial businesses now occupy the site. Elementary schools and parks sit on land that still holds remnants of the explosion. The Garden State Parkway runs through the former munitions site, carrying hundreds of thousands of vehicles daily over ground that once stored enough explosives to supply 6 months of warfare. Families live, work, and raise children above soil that may still contain unexploded ordnance from 1918. The real estate that was considered too dangerous for human habitation in October 1918 is now home to thriving suburban communities whose residents may have no idea what lies beneath their feet. The Morgan explosion was one of several major munitions disasters during the First World War. In Britain, the National Shell Filling Factory at Chilwell exploded in July 1918, killing 134 workers, the deadliest industrial accident in British history to that point. The blast left a crater 60 feet deep and 200 feet wide. Like Morgan, the exact cause was never determined. Like Morgan, the disaster occurred at a facility rushing to meet wartime production quotas. In Canada, the Halifax explosion of December 1917 killed approximately 2,000 people when a munition ship collided with another vessel and detonated in the harbor. The blast destroyed entire neighborhoods and left 10,000 people homeless in the approaching winter. Each disaster revealed the same truth. The scale of industrial warfare had outpaced the safety measures designed to contain it. The pattern would continue throughout the 20th century. The Port Chicago disaster of 1944 killed 320 men, most of them African-American sailors, loading ammunition onto ships bound for the Pacific Theater, and led to a mutiny that helped advance the cause of military desegregation. The Texas City disaster of 1947 killed nearly 600 people when a ship loaded with ammonium nitrate exploded in the harbor, triggering a chain reaction that destroyed much of the industrial waterfront. Each disaster generated investigations, reforms, and promises that such a thing would never happen again. And each disaster was eventually forgotten, its lessons absorbed into regulations that future emergencies would strain or ignore. What made Morgan distinctive was its aftermath. The confluence of the explosion, the evacuation, and the influenza pandemic created a compound catastrophe that defied easy commemoration. The workers who died were neither soldiers nor traditional war casualties. They occupied an ambiguous category: civilians who had served their country in the most dangerous industry of the war, killed not by enemy action, but by accident. Their sacrifice contributed to victory, but their deaths could not be celebrated the way battlefield casualties were honored. This pattern of forgetting continued for decades. The Morgan explosion never achieved the historical prominence of Black Tom or Halifax, disasters that have been the subject of books, documentaries, and museum exhibitions. Black Tom, in particular, achieved lasting notoriety because it was eventually proven to be sabotage, because the damage to the Statue of Liberty provided a tangible and symbolic reminder, and because the decades-long legal battle for German reparations kept the story in public awareness. Halifax achieved prominence through sheer scale: 2,000 dead, entire neighborhoods erased, a disaster so large that it could not be ignored. Morgan occupied a more ambiguous position. Not quite sabotage, the investigation was inconclusive. Not quite the largest, Halifax killed more people. Not quite the most destructive, Black Tom caused more property damage relative to its scale. The Morgan explosion was catastrophic by any reasonable measure, but it was not superlative in any category that captured public imagination. And so it faded, remembered locally but unknown nationally, preserved in the memories of survivors and their descendants, but absent from the broader historical consciousness. Local historians documented the disaster, collecting oral histories from survivors and compiling records that would otherwise have been lost. Frank Yusko, a South Amboy High School history teacher who grew up hearing stories from elderly residents who had witnessed the explosions, produced a documentary in 1994 that preserved first-hand accounts from the last living witnesses. The men and women he interviewed had been children in 1918, 10, 12, 14 years old, and their memories remained vivid after 76 years. They described the sound of the first explosion, the sight of the fire rising into the sky, the fear that gripped them as their families fled into the darkness. They described the cold nights spent outdoors waiting for the explosions to stop, the uncertainty about fathers and brothers who might or might not have survived, the gradual return to homes that had been damaged or looted or both. Randall Gabrielan, Monmouth County's historian, wrote a book in 2012 that remains the most comprehensive published account of the disaster. Drawing on archival records, newspaper accounts, government reports, and the accumulated research of local historians, Gabrielan assembled a narrative that gives the disaster coherent shape. His work ensures that anyone who wants to learn about Morgan has a reliable source to consult, but the book's existence does not guarantee that anyone will seek it out. The Morgan explosion remains a discovery waiting to happen for most Americans, a story that surprises everyone who encounters it for the first time. But outside central New Jersey, the disaster remains largely unknown, a footnote in the history of the First World War, overshadowed by the battles and campaigns that define the conflict in popular memory. The Western Front, Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele, these names evoke the war's carnage for anyone who has studied the period. Morgan evokes nothing except for those who know its history. The survivors carried their memories in silence. Harry Wark, like many workers who escaped the plant that night, suffered from what contemporary accounts called shell shock. He was unable to work for months after the disaster. The term was typically applied to combat veterans, but the workers at Morgan had experienced something comparable: the terror of explosions, the chaos of flight, the uncertainty of survival. They had faced industrial warfare without leaving American soil. The company housing provided by T.A. Gillespie had offered comfortable accommodations by the standards of working-class America in 1918. The Wark family, whose testimony provides some of the most vivid personal accounts of the disaster, remembered their Morgan home as nicer than their previous crowded residence in Brooklyn. The green oak furniture, the relative spaciousness compared to tenement life, the steady income from munitions work, all of these made the risks seem worthwhile. Few workers fully appreciated the magnitude of hazards they faced until Building 611 exploded. The company housing that had seemed like a benefit became, in retrospect, a trap that placed families directly in the path of catastrophe. The communities rebuilt. South Amboy reconstructed its downtown. Perth Amboy recovered from the damage. The evacuees returned to homes that still stood and rebuilt those that didn't. Within a few years, the physical evidence of the disaster had largely disappeared, replaced by new construction and the routine rhythms of post-war American life. The Depression came and went. The Second World War mobilized the nation again, creating new munitions facilities with safety standards improved by the lessons of Morgan and Chilwell and Halifax. Each generation's wars created their own casualties and their own commemoration, pushing the memories of Morgan further into obscurity. The centennial of the disaster passed in 2018, with minimal commemoration. Local news outlets ran retrospective pieces. The documentary footage from 1994 circulated on historical websites, but there was no national recognition. The workers who died at Morgan have no equivalent of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. What happened at Morgan raises questions that extend beyond the specific disaster. How do we commemorate industrial casualties? Workers who die producing the instruments of war rather than wielding them. How do we account for communities that bear the environmental legacy of wartime production decades after the original conflict has ended? How do we balance the urgent demands of national defense against the safety of civilian populations who live near the facilities that make defense possible? These questions are not merely historical. Every war America has fought since 1918 has created its own munitions infrastructure, its own industrial hazards, its own casualties among workers who never deployed overseas. The Second World War built the atomic cities of Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos, communities that still deal with radioactive contamination from the Manhattan Project. The Cold War scattered missile silos and weapons plants across the American heartland, leaving cleanup obligations that will extend for generations. The War on Terror expanded ammunition production to feed military operations that consumed ordnance at rates not seen since Vietnam. Each conflict creates new sites, new hazards, and new populations exposed to risks they did not choose. The government officials who authorized the Morgan plant faced genuine dilemmas. The war demanded shells immediately, in quantities that seemed impossible. Every month the war continued, thousands more soldiers died. The pressure to produce was real, but the workers at Morgan did not choose to live near 30 million pounds of explosives. Many took the job because the wages were good, and the company provided housing, the same housing that placed them directly in the blast zone. The 62,000 people who were evacuated had not consented to live within range of the largest munitions depot in the world. The insurance situation illuminated this injustice with particular clarity. Munitions workers were individually uninsurable because the actuarial risk was too high. No private company would underwrite the lives of people who spent their working hours surrounded by explosives that might detonate at any moment. This was a rational calculation on the part of insurers, but it left workers and their families exposed to catastrophic risk without corresponding protection. The government that required their service in the most dangerous factories of the war did not provide them with equivalent protection. No federal insurance program covered munitions workers. No supplementary death benefits awaited their survivors. When the workers died, their families faced both grief and destitution. The compensation that was eventually paid, $300,000 to cover $18 million in damages, represented less than 2 cents on the dollar. The federal government had created the conditions for the disaster by demanding production at impossible scales and impossible speeds. The federal government had selected the contractor and the location. The federal government had set the production targets that kept the plant operating around the clock with inadequate safety margins. And when the disaster occurred, the federal government paid a fraction of the losses and moved on to other priorities. Hundreds of families struggled to rebuild while the nation celebrated victory. The contrast between public celebration and private suffering was not lost on the communities that had borne the burden of wartime production. The memorial at Ernst Memorial Cemetery remains the only permanent marker of the disaster. The stone above the mass grave offers no names. The identities of those buried beneath it were never determined. It offers only the date and the acknowledgement that the dead gave their lives in service to their country. The cemetery is not on tourist maps. The dead lie in anonymity, remembered only by relatives who still tend the grave, and historians who have kept the story alive. The few remaining survivors are gone now. The 12-year-old who watched shrapnel fly through her kitchen window, the workers who ran through the burning plant, the evacuees who spent cold October nights in open fields, they have all passed away. Their memories survived in the documentary footage collected in 1994, in the oral histories preserved by local historians, in stories passed down through families. But living memory is finite. What remains is the land itself, still hiding its secrets. Every construction project in the affected area carries the possibility of discovery. Every shovel that breaks ground might uncover a shell that has lain dormant for over a century. The explosive compounds inside these shells do not degrade on human timescales. A child digging in a backyard, a construction worker excavating for a foundation, any of them might encounter a piece of the First World War that has been waiting all this time. The ongoing remediation represents a kind of debt that the present owes to the past. The decisions made in 1918 to build the plant, to site it near population centers, to operate it at maximum capacity with minimal safety margins, created consequences that extend far beyond the immediate disaster. The workers who died paid one price. The families who lost loved ones paid another. The communities that were evacuated and infected paid a third. And now, over a century later, the descendants continue to pay through the taxes that fund the Army Corps of Engineers and the risks that remain in soil that was never fully cleared. The parallels between Morgan and other industrial disasters illuminate a pattern that would repeat throughout the 20th century. When production demands exceed safety capacity, when profit or patriotism override precaution, when workers are treated as expendable resources, the same catastrophes occur. Morgan was one iteration of a template that would claim lives in Texas City in 1947, in Bhopal in 1984, in West Texas in 2013. The specific explosives change, the regulations evolve, the industries transform, but the fundamental dynamic persists. Concentrated industrial hazards plus insufficient safety measures plus proximity to populated areas equals disaster. The formula is not inevitable. Societies can choose to site hazardous facilities away from population centers, even when transportation logistics favor closer proximity. Societies can choose to invest in safety measures that slow production and increase costs. Societies can choose to compensate workers adequately for the risks they assume and to protect communities that host dangerous industries. These choices cost money, time, and competitive advantage. They are made only when societies value safety sufficiently to pay the price. The Morgan disaster occurred because the society of 1918 had not yet learned to value these choices, or rather, because the urgency of war overrode the values that might otherwise have prevailed. Every month the war continued. Soldiers died for lack of ammunition. Every shell that didn't reach the front was a shell that couldn't be fired at the enemy. Against this calculus, the safety of 6,000 workers in New Jersey seemed like an acceptable risk. The calculation proved wrong, but it was not made frivolously. It was made under conditions of genuine emergency by people who understood the stakes on both sides of the equation. The British had learned these lessons through bitter experience. The shell crisis of 1915 revealed that pre-war planning had catastrophically underestimated ammunition requirements. The government had assumed that existing arsenals could supply the relatively small British expeditionary force with the shells it needed. The trenches of France revealed the catastrophic error of this assumption. Artillery consumed shells at rates previously unimaginable, and British soldiers died because their guns fell silent for lack of ammunition to fire. The British response was dramatic. The Ministry of Munitions, created in 1915 under David Lloyd George, nationalized key industries and constructed vast new factories. Women entered the munitions workforce in unprecedented numbers. Over 700,000 British women worked in munitions by the war's end, becoming the famous munitionettes who kept the shells flowing to France. They handled the same TNT that turned their skin yellow and damaged their livers, accepting risks that male workers also faced, but that fell disproportionately on women in certain sections of the plants. The British paid their own price. Chilwell exploded 3 months before Morgan, killing 134. Unlike Morgan, Chilwell achieved lasting commemoration. A memorial in St. Mary's Church at Attenborough records the names of those who died. The British government treated munitions workers as essential war workers whose sacrifice deserved recognition alongside that of soldiers. The British dead received recognition that the American dead at Morgan were largely denied. The comparison is instructive. British munitions disasters were incorporated into the national narrative of wartime sacrifice, treated as casualties of the war effort alongside battlefield dead. American munitions disasters occupied a more ambiguous position, not quite military casualties, not quite industrial accidents, falling between categories in ways that made commemoration difficult. The American tradition of honoring military service had not yet developed frameworks for recognizing the contributions of industrial workers who served their country without wearing uniforms. This distinction extended to survivors. Combat veterans returning from France could access networks of support. The American Legion, founded in 1919, the Veterans Bureau, established in 1921, disability compensation systems that evolved over the following decades. These institutions were imperfect, as the Bonus Army March of 1932 would demonstrate, but they represented a national acknowledgement that those who served in uniform had earned special consideration. Munitions workers had no equivalent infrastructure. Those who survived Morgan with injuries or trauma had to seek help through general civilian channels, competing with the larger population for resources that were not designed to address their specific needs. The shell shock experienced by Harry Wark was particularly revealing. The term had been coined to describe psychological damage suffered by soldiers exposed to combat. Constant shelling, fear of death, witnessing horrific injuries. The symptoms included tremors, nightmares, inability to concentrate, emotional numbness, and sudden panic in situations that resembled the original trauma. Doctors debated whether the condition was physical or psychological, whether it represented damage to the nervous system from concussive blasts or breakdown of the mind from prolonged stress. Whatever its nature, shell shock was recognized as a legitimate consequence of military service, deserving of medical attention and social sympathy. But the workers at Morgan had experienced remarkably similar conditions. Explosions, fire, chaos, death, and the desperate flight from an environment where survival depended on luck and quick reflexes. Their trauma was functionally identical to combat trauma. They had witnessed the same sudden deaths, heard the same deafening blasts, felt the same helpless terror of being caught in events beyond their control. Yet their condition lacked the cultural framework that acknowledged and validated veteran suffering. A soldier returning from France with shell shock was a hero damaged by service. A munitions worker returning from Morgan with the same symptoms was simply damaged. The technical challenges of remediation remain substantial. Unexploded ordnance from the First World War stays dangerous because the explosive compounds do not degrade significantly over time. TNT and ammonium nitrate retain their explosive potential indefinitely under favorable storage conditions. The shells scattered across Morgan in 1918 are as capable of detonating today as when they were loaded over a century ago. Time has done nothing to render them safe. The fuses may have corroded, the casings may have rusted, but the explosive fillers remain potent, waiting for the impact or friction that will trigger their designed function. Removing these shells requires specialized expertise, careful excavation, and controlled disposal, processes that are expensive, time-consuming, and dangerous. Explosive ordnance disposal technicians must approach each discovered item as if it could detonate at any moment, because it could. Some shells can be safely transported to demolition ranges, where they can be destroyed under controlled conditions. Others are too unstable to move and must be neutralized in place, with surrounding areas evacuated as a precaution. The work proceeds methodically, but there is no guarantee that every shell will ever be found. Some lie too deep, some are located beneath structures that cannot be demolished, and some simply evade detection by the geophysical instruments used to locate them. The residents of Sayreville, South Amboy, and Old Bridge have learned to live with this reality. When shells surface, they call authorities. When construction projects encounter buried ordnance, work stops until the material is removed. The occasional discoveries no longer provoke the alarm they might in communities without this history. There is a grimly routine quality to finding pieces of the First World War in your backyard. The communities have absorbed this knowledge into their collective consciousness, accepting that some dangers cannot be fully eliminated, only managed. The economic dimensions are significant but often invisible. Property values in contaminated areas are affected, though the extent varies depending on how prominently the contamination features in local awareness. Some buyers know nothing of the site's history, Others know everything and factor the risk into their calculations. Insurance coverage may be complicated by the presence of unexploded ordnance. Policies may exclude damage from munitions, or premiums may be elevated, or coverage may simply be unavailable for certain parcels. Development projects must incorporate the cost of environmental assessment and potential remediation, expenses that add to construction budgets and may make marginal projects economically unviable. These expenses are distributed across property owners, developers, insurers, and taxpayers in ways that obscure the true cost of the original disaster. The $18 million assessed in 1918 was only the beginning. The ongoing costs continue to accumulate over a century later, borne by people who had no voice in the decisions that created the hazard. The psychological dimensions are equally significant and even harder to quantify. How do communities process the knowledge that their land holds lethal remnants of a distant war? How do parents feel when shells are discovered near their children's schools? The question is not whether the risk is significant in actuarial terms. The probability of any given child being harmed by a century-old shell is vanishingly small, but whether the presence of such hazards affects how people experience their homes and neighborhoods. Some residents report that the knowledge changes nothing for them. The danger is too abstract, too historical, too unlikely to manifest. Others find the presence of unexploded ordnance deeply unsettling, a reminder that the ground beneath their feet holds secrets they would prefer not to contemplate. Workers on construction sites face their own psychological burden. The discovery of ordnance triggers immediate work stoppages, evacuations of the surrounding area, and the arrival of Army explosive ordnance disposal teams. These responses are necessary and appropriate, but they also serve as vivid reminders that the normal rules of construction do not apply here. A backhoe operator who uncovers a shell has done nothing wrong, has followed all procedures correctly, and yet finds himself standing in a cordoned area while specialists in protective gear approach an object that could kill everyone present. The experience leaves marks. Some workers refuse subsequent assignments in the affected area. Others accept the risk as they accept all occupational hazards, filing the experience away as part of the job. The passage of generations has transformed memory at Morgan. The survivors are gone. Their children, who heard first-hand accounts, are now elderly or deceased. Great-grandchildren know the story, if at all, as distant family history. The documentary footage from 1994 captured the last living witnesses. Those interviews are now themselves historical artifacts, voices speaking across time about events that shaped their lives, but that most Americans have never heard of. This generational distance creates both challenges and opportunities. The emotional immediacy has faded, making it harder to generate public attention for memorial projects. The passions that might have driven commemoration in the immediate aftermath have long since cooled. But distance also allows for more analytical perspectives. Understanding Morgan not just as tragedy, but as example, a case study in the costs of industrial warfare, the limits of safety regulation, and the environmental persistence of military production. Historians can now see Morgan in context, comparing it to earlier and later disasters, identifying patterns that were invisible to those who experienced the original event. The work of local historians to document the Morgan disaster represents a form of resistance to forgetting. Frank Yusko's documentary preserved the voices of survivors at the last possible moment, capturing testimony that would otherwise have been lost entirely. The elderly men and women who appeared on camera in 1994 were children in 1918, but their memories of that night remained vivid after 76 years. The sound of the explosions, the sight of the fire, the fear of the flight, the uncertainty about family members whose fate was unknown. Randall Gabrielan's book compiled archival records into a comprehensive narrative that gives the disaster a coherent shape. These efforts cannot restore the identities of the unidentified dead, but they can ensure that the story itself is not forgotten, that future generations will know what happened at Morgan even if they cannot know exactly who died there. The Morgan explosion was not the most deadly industrial disaster in American history, or the most destructive act of the First World War. It was simply one disaster among many, notable primarily for the compound tragedy created by its intersection with the influenza pandemic, and for the persistence of its environmental legacy more than 100 years later. But in that ordinariness lies significance. The workers who died were ordinary Americans doing extraordinary work under impossible conditions. They were not soldiers, but they served. They were not heroes in the conventional sense, but they accepted risks most would refuse. They produced shells that helped win the war, and they paid with their lives. Their anonymity, the lost records, the vaporized remains, the unidentified bodies, speaks to a larger anonymity in America's experience of industrial warfare. Homefront casualties are rarely commemorated with the reverence accorded battlefield dead. Their service is essential but unromantic. Their sacrifice is real but uncelebrated. The distinction matters because it shapes how societies prepare for and respond to future conflicts. If industrial workers are understood as serving their country with the same dedication as uniformed soldiers, then their safety deserves the same consideration that military planners give to the welfare of troops. If their deaths are understood as casualties of war, albeit casualties that occur in factories rather than trenches, then their families deserve the same support that military families receive. If the communities that host wartime production facilities are understood as serving the national interest, then they deserve the same protections and compensations that military installations provide to their host communities. The workers at Morgan served their country in a capacity that was essential to victory. They died because the facilities where they worked were inadequate to contain the hazards they faced. Their deaths contributed nothing to the war effort. The shells they died loading were never fired. The war ended before their sacrifice could be redeemed by military victory. They gave everything and received nothing in return. No medals, no pensions, no monuments, no place in the national memory of the war they helped to win. The memorial stone at Ernst Memorial Cemetery offers the only epitaph, "In memory of the unidentified dead who gave their lives while in the service of the United States of America at the Morgan Shell Loading Plant in the explosion of October 4-5, 1918. These words acknowledge both service and tragedy. The dead gave their lives, but we cannot name them. They served their country, but we cannot honor them individually. They lie together in a grave that represents not triumph but loss, the loss of life, identity, and memory itself. The cemetery is not on tourist maps. No highway markers direct travelers to the site. No school children make pilgrimages on Veterans Day to place flags on the grave of the anonymous dead. The memorial exists primarily for those who seek it out, descendants of survivors, local historians, the occasional researcher who encounters the Morgan story and wants to see where it ended. These visitors find a modest stone in a quiet corner of a suburban cemetery, unremarkable to anyone who doesn't know its significance. The shells from Morgan wait beneath subdivisions and playgrounds and parking lots, patient as stone, as dangerous as the day they were loaded. The war to end all wars left debris that will outlast everyone now living. The homefront casualties of 1918 created an environmental legacy that extends indefinitely into the future. Every year that passes brings new construction, new excavation, new possibility that a child's shovel or a construction crew's backhoe will uncover another piece of that October night. On October 4th, 1918, Margaret Walk stood at her kitchen sink in the company housing at Morgan, New Jersey. Her daughter was at the window when the world exploded. The family survived. Others were not so fortunate. The ground still holds what was scattered that night. The memorial still stands above the anonymous dead, and the story continues, whether we remember it or not. If you want to explore another forgotten industrial disaster, the places where America built its power and then watched everything disappear, leave a comment below. The furnaces are cold now, the machines are silent, but the stories remain, waiting to be told.